Welcome to SHIUR 1700 Leipzig Rosh Hashana. Radical renewal. Where we all will explore the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashana. The second in a special series, part of the Jüdisches Leben in Deutschland 1700. That the SHIUR project is proud to be a part of. There is a symbiotic relationship between German culture and Jewish culture. Both have been influenced and have influenced one another. The goal of SHIUR 1700 is to proactively cultivate innovative content that reflects this interconnectedness by partnering traditional Jewish content with contemporary culture to create something new and alive. As opposed to offering a voyeuristic look into Judaism, SHIUR 1700 takes a partnership approach. That, we hope, creates the latest phase of innovation in the German-Jewish encounter and offers memorable and transformative content that is dynamic and will inspire new and unforeseen Jewish-German experiences. Rosh Hashana is traditionally known as the Jewish New Year, when we celebrate the creation of the world, and is traditionally associated with renewal and repurposing. So you see, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar with different months. So you might have, or in the non-Jewish world, there's September and October. We have Tishrei. In the secular calendar, you'll have April, March or April, we'll have Nisan. So we have different months. This is a very ancient calendar. So today we're going to explore this theme that is associated with renewal and repurposing through text-based discourse, a music and sound performance, and exploring the unique Pittlerwerke space that we're all in right now here in Leipzig. The sages of the Talmud argued whether the world was created in the month of Tishrei, in the autumn, or the month of Nisan, in spring. The French scholar Rabbeinu Tam attempted to reconcile the conflicting views by suggesting that in Tishrei the idea of the world was conceived, but it was not actually created in material form until Nisan. Indeed, as the mystic Rabbi Isaac Luria observed, in the Rosh Hashanah service, we say the following. Donna, if you can read the first text, please.
Today the word was conceived, another word was created, because on Tishrei was the conception.
Thank you. So I want to ask you, what are the implications of this debate? What is the difference between conception, when you conceive of something, and creation when it comes into reality?
For me, conception is like the idea of something. I'm creating an idea of whatever I want to. I'm creating an idea of something what I want to create in a material way. an idea is like a conception, but actually many ideas are not being created in a way.
So now, if we focus again, just a bit of the really simple differences. So when something is in a state of conception, it's not limited in the same form as when it comes out, right? So like you have an abstract idea, and for those of you that are composers or dancers or creators, like what happens? What is the difference between what you conceive of an idea and how it actually happens? Is it the same or is it different?
Yeah, I would say when you first have an idea, it can be quite fluid. Like parts of it are changing in your mind, maybe from one day to the next. And maybe it happens in such a natural way that you don't even notice that it's changing in your mind. But then once you create it, once it's real, it exists and it's there and it's, not changing anymore.
Excellent. I think you hit it right on the nail. So just to kind of reiterate what you're saying is when something is conceived, it's still fluid and dynamic. It's not given form yet, and it's still alive. The minute it's put into form, the minute it comes out, you're no longer able to control it. It has its own life, and it's kind of fixed, and it is what it is. So with that in mind, we can think about Rosh Hashanah in a certain way, where Rosh Hashanah is a return to that state of conception, before things were fixed. And indeed, in Rosh Hashanah, we have a Jewish concept called teshuvah, where we explore return. Teshuvah means return. So might Rosh Hashanah be a return to that pre-formed state, before things were messed up by becoming real? There is always a tension between idea and form that is most acutely felt in the disappointments and suffering we experience in life, when things don't turn out the way we would like them to, or the way we thought they would. Have you ever wished you could unsee or unknow something? How wonderful it would be simply to return to that heightened state before things are defined. According to this way of looking at the world, Rosh Hashanah is the opportunity to return to that awakening, creative moment that is alive yet not given form. This state of nothingness or no-thingness, referred to by the Kabbalists as ayin, without form or definition, yet paradoxically rich and divinely full, according to the mystical tradition, is the ultimate state strived for in Jewish spiritual life. The greatest obstacle to nothingness, of course, is form. And of all the Jewish holidays, Rosh Hashanah is the most self-centered and focused on the variety of forms that the self has taken. So you see, in Rosh Hashanah, it's a time that we engage in introspection. We think about who we are in the most defined way. You explore your personality, your traits, your ethics, and you ask yourself, is this where I want to be right now? So there's a certain paradox here. On the one hand, we're returning to this kind of primordial pre-creation state. On the other hand, it's a holiday that's very much focused on how life has actually come to be. In Hebrew, the word for I, ani, spelled with the letters Aleph, Nun, Yud, and nothingness, ayin, Aleph, Yud, Nun, are made up of the exact same letters. And the return, or teshuvah, of Rosh Hashanah can be a reconfiguration where the I, the ani, returns to the ayin, to nothingness. So we see this incredible meeting point between self and nothing. We might observe that the most creative, revealing moments of humanity are precisely when we are free from the more limiting, individuated notions of self. Teshuvah is returning to this creative state. We can look to the following text by the 20th century scholar of Zen, D.T. Suzuki, to get an idea of what this reconfiguration can be like. David?
The essence of Zen Buddhism consists in acquiring a new viewpoint of looking at life and things generally. We must forego all our ordinary habits of thinking which control our everyday life. We must try to see if there is any other way of judging things, or rather, if our ordinary way is always sufficient to give us the ultimate satisfaction of our spiritual needs. This acquirement, however, is really and naturally the greatest mental cataclysm one can go through within life. It is no easy task. One has to go through the storm, the earthquake, the overthrowing of mountains, and the breaking in pieces of the rocks.
Thank you. So let's take this apart a little bit. So the first part is challenging this notion of like a true self. So much of what you think is you is a product of a larger structure. So what Suzuki is arguing is there needs to be a complete reconfiguration, a complete breaking and shattering of the way that you organize life. It's kind of like a clean slate. And one thing I want to highlight here, he talks about this process as something being very violent, of being very broken. And I think this is one of the themes that we ought to explore, and we are exploring. We're here right now in a city that was affected by the war, that was affected by a complete change of an economic system. We're sitting in an abandoned factory. And I think it's interesting how sometimes the brokenness and this kind of overthrowing of mountains, what it does is it can either lead to tragedy, to a sense of tragedy, or it can completely break whatever organizing principles there were before. And that leads to something much more powerful and innovative. But still, if we want it, as much as we'd like to talk about this pre-individuated state, this abstract state, form is key to life. And it's key to how we experience life. And Judaism is deeply concerned with how we behave and relate within the forms of life that we live in. According to the conception line of thinking, Rosh Hashana is the time we return to the nothingness and make new ourselves, conceiving a new sense of being and self that will be given form and be created in social and material life. After all, conception leads to birth, right? And this is the point. So it's not only about like entering this kind of fluid, wild, dynamic state and then telling the rest of the world, sorry. It still acknowledges our situatedness in society and in our world. But sometimes we can refreshen ourselves. We can completely revamp and reconfigure ourselves so that we can enter that world again and not withdraw into some hermetic existence in a far-flung monastery, but rather enter the city, enter society, but with a completely, radically different way of viewing things. So I'm also curious when it comes to, and this is something maybe Erika, you can address. You created those incredible electronic garments that the musicians wore that pick up their movements and create a whole new form of sound and music that is quite innovative. I'm not sure how long it's been around for. And I'm curious, and also I know you do digital fashion. I'm curious, how do you relate to this idea of both cleaning the slate, but also acknowledging that the world hasn't cleaned its slate, and you're still operating in a world that doesn't know about what you might conceive?
So yeah, so it's very exciting also, right? Because you're breaking new ground on new technology, and you sort of find yourself in a position to define aesthetically what happens in that field. And what I try to do when I'm sort of working with a new medium is just to like experiment as much as possible, as much as time allows also. Like in 3D, just pressing random buttons, seeing what happens, and sort of letting go of the control a bit, because when you're first starting, you cannot control it anyway, and you kind of want to find the connection between your head and your hands, I guess. So like figuring out how can I communicate with this medium. And
how do you relate, like in the sense of society is not there yet, so you at the same time that you want to introduce something new, you also need to somehow manage something that is communicable, that people can receive and access. So do you, how do you take that balance into account?
So I guess just talking about what I do, explaining how it works so that people can understand what's behind the things that you're making, because if they just see it for face value, they might not understand the complexity of it, or yeah, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, so what I'm hearing is that content, you need knowledge to really appreciate at this point what you're making. Otherwise, it's like abstract, like modern art, that people need to acknowledge the situatedness in order to get the full appreciation of it.
Or it might be compared to something that already exists, when in fact it's very different. So somehow showing what is new about it, what is, yeah, exciting, then
Exactly.
that changes a bit what you're communicating also, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
I could add something to it, because I got involved because I was not part of the technical side and of the innovative part of it. So I was just brought in caught by my own curiosity, right? So people would talk to me, we are trying this new thing. Do you want to be part of it? Do you want to try with us? So the question, like, how do you do it? You make people curious, she managed to make us curious, and her team. And so we wanted to be in it.
We were also curious how you work as musicians. We wanted to know, what is your practice? How do you get into a piece, or how do you work with your instrument specifically? And for us, it was a lot about that exchange also, yeah.
Reb Menachem Tversky of Chernobyl observed in his book, The Meor Einayim, that the language that the sages of the Talmud used to describe the creation was on Tishrei, the world was or is created, Nivra, and not on Tishrei, God created, Bara, the world. Why? Because in truth, on each Rosh Hashana, the world is created. So this is a very powerful and subversive idea that says every single year, it's not that we're commemorating a past event, but actually the world is created, and we're involved in that creation. This perspective frees Rosh Hashanah and all of us from being stuck in an historical and commemorative holiday, like the birthday of the world or humanity, to one that is entirely present and creative. In other words, Rosh Hashanah is not the time we commemorate a past creation, but rather when we are proactively involved in creating a new world. We are world makers. According to the Meor Anayim, if we do not take on the task of world making, the world will revert to chaos. This Kabbalistic idea is incredibly intuitive in that it recognizes the meaninglessness of things without context. If we don't create a world of meaning, there will be no world of meaning. I want to repeat that. If we do not create a world of meaning, there will be no world of meaning. And there is no history in the beginning. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a beginning. Hence, the beginning that we enact on Rosh Hashanah is inherently ahistorical and feeds directly into life, into a new life and new world. If we take the world-making task, the next question would be how? Or more specifically, what role does the tradition, in this case Rosh Hashanah, in all its forms, play in world-making? So I'd like to kind of reiterate. Rosh Hashanah is a holiday. It happens once a year. Now there's kind of a surface level understanding of this holiday, which is we celebrate the creation of the world, but then we go deeper, as we're doing right now, and we realize that all worlds are created by us, how we choose to conceive of our world. So Rosh Hashanah, each Rosh Hashanah is an opportunity to recreate the world, to be world makers through our subjectivity, through cultivating a subjectivity. Whether it be the images of Instagram or the texts of the sages, we are constantly subject to influences and inputs that shape and give meaning to our lives. As we saw above, it would be absurd to imagine that meaning and truth are not situated in some context. The choice might be, as we emerge from the Rosh Hashanah experience, what contexts and situatedness do we want to be subject to? Chaos? Nothingness? Something else?
What I find interesting is that there's like a responsibility for each and every person to create. Like with this idea of each year, the world is created and we create it. We are part of this creation. Like for me, there's like a sense of responsibility to actually seize that opportunity and do something or decide to do nothing. But then that's also part of a responsibility you have.
I think that's an excellent point. We are all responsible. And whether we want to or not, we're still going to be involved in enacting our world. So what happens is, and this is to me what's really important, I want to share with you Jewish tradition and Jewish culture beyond, this is a holiday. But to understand the deeper inner core that many within Jewish history and the Jewish traditions have engaged in. And I think that ritual and tradition can be that opportunity to say, hey, whether I like it or not, I have that responsibility and I'm going to live up to that responsibility. And we're going to do that collectively. The American Israeli theologian Tamar Ross sees the language and practices of tradition as the tools of world making that Judaism offers. David.
Adopted metaphors can literally create worlds and determine their nature. On this view, religious truths that were first justified instrumentally will eventually be confirmed by their ability to lead us to a level of experience which is recognizably beyond that which we have previously known, not only on the existential and subjective level, but even in terms of the infinite possibilities capable of being realized in our external reality.
Thank you. So what Professor Ross is saying here is that traditions and even dogmas or religious truths, their origins might be one place, but today, or or as they develop, they bring us to another place. And we don't necessarily need to correspond them to some fundamental reality. Instead, they produce their own realities. They generate their own contexts that bring us somewhere else, somewhere special maybe, to that. And something that offers a new possibility that wouldn't have existed in the past. And I think that's another thing that is very relevant to what we're doing today, is we're attempting to look at these old traditions and see what they can where they can bring us to. Now, there's no doubt that in ancient Israel, they probably had a very different reading than what we're engaging with today. But then again, the way they saw the world is very different than the way we see the world. And the worlds that they created were different than the worlds that we create. Indeed, great minds have sought to free themselves of the conceiving and possibly deceiving mind. The Zen Buddhists have mushin, no mind, while the Kabbalists have afisat hamachshava, annihilation of thought. In our times, as we have embraced multiple narratives, critical theory, language games, mindfulness, and other ways of organizing life that challenge a unified essentialist structure, have we moved towards the non-discrimination that the mystics sought? Through our entanglement with all the suchness of our intersecting lives, are we inadvertently engaging in a process of de-alienation? So I ask this question in reference to what we're talking about, which is that we can no longer look for some fixed truth, some thread of reality that we are always trying to correspond to. Instead, we can say that there are multiple truths, there are multiple worlds.
Of course.
So, just to kind of reiterate that part, seeking a kind of continuous truth that our lives need to consistently reconfigure and realign with is not necessarily the only way of organizing life. We can also see multiple worlds, and by worlds I don't mean, of course, like an ontological, sci-fi notion of dimensions and worlds, but as the way that we organize and conceive life. And I think what's interesting is that when you accept that multiplicity, there's no blank spaces in between. Everything is somehow interlocked, and you jump from one to the other, but there's never a moment of emptiness. And this might be that process of de-alienation. The contemporary philosopher, Karen Barad, explores how the very notion of an individual, subjective, self-contained self is an impossibility. Barad writes the following text, and I invite Erika to read.
To be entangled is not simply to be intertwined with another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence. Existence is not an individual affair. Individuals do not pre-exist their interactions. Rather, individuals emerge through and as a part of their entangled intra-relating, which is not to say that emergence happens once and for all, as an event or as a process that takes place according to some external measure of space and time, but rather that time and space, like matter and meaning, come into existence, are iteratively reconfigured through each interaction, thereby making it impossible to differentiate in any absolute sense between creation and renewal, beginning and returning, continuity and discontinuity, here and there, past and future.
Thank you. There's a lot in here, and I'll just highlight a few things. One is the marvelous word intra-action rather than interaction. And Barad likes this word, and I like it too, because there is no interaction. There's no me and you. I am me by virtue of you being you in our interaction with each other. there's no pure individuality because we are always entangled.
Yeah, I might add to what you just said, that especially in this hopefully post-corona, almost post-corona times, we feel this more than ever before. I think that we felt it in all our lives before, that the self sitting alone in his, her room is not working. It just doesn't work, right? So we don't feel ourselves, the self, if not in the connection. And I think at the moment we all know it better than ever before in time, right?
Absolutely. I think the concept is accentuated when we have deep emotional disconnects from our involvement with the world. And I also think it's interesting is that for people that were capable of contending with this solitude, one of the ways was to not feel alone, even if they physically were alone. It's interesting how sometimes by acknowledging that you're sharing in your alienation and in your solitude with a whole bunch of other people, there's also a feeling of like a little bit better, like, hey, it all sucks.
And I want to say that the word alone contains that, right? It's all one.
All one. Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. Freeing ourselves from preconceived meaning and forms allows us to create new meaning and forms from the contents of life in ways that we would not even imagine while we were stuck in a particular way of thinking. Rosh Hashana offers us the framework to enter a space of transforming the I to nothingness. This is the process of creation that constitutes Rosh Hashana as the beginning of the world. So, to reiterate, to look back at what we said and kind of put this into a narrative, we realize that we are never alone. We are always involved in something. And in order to get to that creative state before we were sucked into these limiting forms, we maybe need to return. We need to go back to that state of conception. But that state of conception is a state that is very much embedded in non-form. So in order to get to a better form, sometimes we need to withdraw from that form and return. And I think that acknowledging the situatedness just is the easiest way to let those walls of form fall down. And a kind of living example is where we are right now. It takes a certain type of mind to say, hey, just because this was built as an industrial building doesn't mean that we have to keep using it as an industrial building. We could completely reconceive what the space can be used for. And the same can be said with an instrument. Certainly people that created computers didn't have in mind that they were creating also future instruments or other things. And likewise, when it comes to sound as art, or sound as music, the trend today is very much in the direction of found sound and of instrumentalizing things that were not necessarily made to be music. So I think it's very interesting too to see how the zeitgeist really reflects this attitude. David, why don't you read the next text? This is from Elizabeth Gross's discussion of the French thinker Gilbert Simondon.
Simondon posits that the individual who creates something new, whether a work of art, a piece of writing, a machine or an invention, however humble, undertakes a process of disindividuation, a process of disinvesting their individuality, their personality or personhood, in order to summon up a part of the pre-individual necessary to create. This creation is not simply self-expression, because there is something profoundly impersonal, perhaps even immaterial, about the process of summoning up, creating or inventing the new. It is something within an individual, something impersonal that an individual may sometimes call upon to extend themselves into the organization of this new creation. It is not I who creates, but something of the pre-individual within the I.
Thank you. As we emerge from the disindividuated to the individuated self, we draw upon the contents of practice and language in a new way, creating a new world. What contents do you want to draw upon? What world will you make? So what we see here is something kind of paradoxical, something ironic, where a great work of creativity and art is one that taps into that which is not personal, that which is maybe sublime. And we oftentimes will hear that in discussions about great works of art. That you'll say, wow, this, I see something heavenly here, I see something divine or sublime. And there's an irony, because those great works of art are usually ascribed to genius, not to something that is mass-made or something without intent. So you'll look at something, an amazing composition in music or a painting that is so unique to the artist, but then you'll say, what's so special about it is that it transcends the uniqueness of its time and place.
But also then you do not acknowledge the work that's behind the art. So the composer or the painter did put a lot of effort and experience in that. And if you just say it's transcends from somewhere, then you forgot about that.
I think that's the paradox. That's the irony, is that oftentimes that which is considered the most transcendent involves shedding its creator. But at the same time, I think your point is very well taken in that we ought not to. There's a tension, both I think as individuals and also as artists, between tapping into the sublime kind of this thing that is somehow that transcends time and history and form, and also the irony that it is only through a certain authenticity to a time, place, and form that you can achieve that state. And I think we maybe always are wavering between those two poles, where we want to be as personal and unique to ourselves as we can be, but at the same time, we want to tap into something that does not feel limited by what is unique to us. David, you were going to say something?
Before you said this idea of that the artwork is something transcending individuality, and then you have this paradox of that the artist itself is not being recognized, or the work. And I think also it happens the other way around also. Like, there are some artists who feel like they're not themselves actually creating it, but they are like kind of like an instrument, just it flows through them, the energy, and then it's just like, whoa, I've just created that, and you cannot, like, you couldn't think of it like conceiving it, but it's suddenly there, and you're like, wow, this is really special, and you don't feel it's yours. So, and that's also this kind of, and they don't how to say, they don't feel like it's their work in that sense. So
yeah, I think maybe what you're describing has been described in the past as flow, where sometimes when you enter a state of flow, you dissolve identity and you become kind of one. It's a very Zen idea. And it's also an idea that's very much connected, at least in the Jewish tradition, between the notion of a prophet and a sage. So a prophet is an instrument who receives and who's not necessarily responsible for what they receive. And a sage is one that achieves that state, but through their own growth and their own work. And I think that that's something that's interesting too, that we might want to actually not try to get into that state of flow by falling back, but rather to rise up to that ability through our own skill and work and craft. And then you get to that same state, but it's one that is achieved through growth rather than through mere luck. The Jewish tradition has much to say on the subject. The Roman-era Jewish leader, Rebbe, or Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, advises to, quote-unquote, look in the following phrase. Dana?
Know what it's about from you.
We can first ask, why does he use the phrase look in rather than think about or understand? So just to clarify, the text in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, it has him saying, look into the phrase, know what is above from you, rather than saying, understand the phrase. So we have to first ask the question, what does it mean to look into something? What does looking at something mean? What does looking in something include, and what does looking in something exclude? So I think this is a perfect opportunity to read a quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'll invite Maja to read this one.
It's very short. Don't think, but look.
Thank you. Let's look at this phrase right now. We see here that looking is set against thinking. It is as if that looking accepts an image or state of things without yet organizing them. Like how a camera can take a photograph without having to know what is being photographed. Each viewer of the photograph can organize the meaning of the contents differently. Admittedly, some aspects can be perceived with less volition than others. So you see the point here? It's like a camera takes the picture, but it doesn't necessarily organize what it is. It doesn't say this is a horse or these are clouds. And that picture can exist for years until we define that as a horse and that as a cloud. We can also define it as something completely different.
But it's really hard. I mean, do you have some instincts that take things in an order, like you're counting instinctively, and so taking that away, it's really hard to do.
Exactly, it's a big challenge. This idea of teshuvah, of going back, of returning to a state where you didn't organize things the way you do right now. It takes a lot of unlearning. Erika?
It just reminds me of drawing classes that we had in art school, of relearning how to see things. And we had these exercises called blind drawings, where you were not allowed to look at the page and you just look at the thing you're drawing and you draw on the paper, but you're not allowed to look down. And it really, it's very interesting, the result, first of all, to see what came out of it. But also, if you draw then for several years and you do blind drawings from the beginning to 5 years later, the blind drawings also change. And it really teaches you to inspect things as forms from the inside out. That's what a teacher also told me at some point, is to think of things from the inside out, to think of the body from the inside out, not just the surface, but yeah. So
amazing. Like, I couldn't think of a better example of that. I'm curious, Paul, with machine learning, because it's also very similar, where as the machine learns, it also has less and less of a blank slate.
Yeah, I mean, you have to tell the machine what it has to, what it should see. Like, if you just if you don't label anything, then it will recognize something, but it's not necessarily that what you expect. So if you label you have some pictures and you label just a cat, then you cannot expect it to see a dog.
Mm-hmm.
So
or to see like machines make funny mistakes often.
Yeah, sure.
You know, we all might have experienced that with Google Translate, where the machine, it looks at it very differently. Interesting. I'm curious, Maja, when you improvise in music, have you experimented with trying to erase your inclinations to get to a different state of improvisation?
Yes, but that opens a huge field. I mean, I'm sure the jazz musicians would agree. I mean, I have experienced both that I surprise myself, and that where does that come from? But in the same amount of times, maybe even more often, I find myself repeating my patterns, right? Like a machine that learned some things, maybe not last week, but 15 years ago. And then, so the more creative moment is not always if I empty my mind, then the things that I didn't see in the corners then might come out.
Beautiful. That's an incredible point back to this idea of transformation and return and renewal. Oftentimes, the very act of renewal makes new again what was old. The thing that you might have thought was gone. Sometimes by emptying out what's on the front, you get to what's on the back. It's an interesting return.
But the claim, maybe you want to say the same thing. It is interesting because often with improvisation, the claim is made that this is like, in the moment, something new is created. And it can be like that, but it has also the tendency that the most spontaneous you are, the most you have to rely on things that you know and that are not new at all. So a couple of weeks ago I had someone speaking about improvisation, and she said, I found a way out of that dilemma. I transcribed every movement that I did making a coffee. Also the ones that I don't pay attention to usually. And now I just play with the ones that I didn't look at before. So she wanted to do her habits and find within the habits, find the little moments where she's kind of, well, but maybe it's too far.
No,
right?
but this is excellent because this very much leads us to the next part, what we're going to talk about, which is an important tenet of Jewish mystical thought, is the idea that no place is void of the divine. We can explore what divine means another time. What we'll focus now is the decentralized aspect of this idea and the implicit responsibility demanded upon us to reveal the divine. So kind of like what you were talking about, where by decentralizing what is considered, of value and what is and looking in the minor moments of life as something that can offer just as much value as what you call central, you suddenly open up a whole new range of possibilities as to content. And this aligns very much with Jewish mystical thought, which seeks to radically equalize the field of sanctity and divine. The current digital life that many of us are confronted with mirrors this structure. The digital realm can be highly decentralized, and how we relate, interact, and live through it is dependent upon us. The shock of a decentralized way of life can be alienating, as central figures and hierarchies of values are challenged and reconfigured. But like the Kabbalists discovered, suddenly nothing is marginal. And everything offers a potential pathway to revealing depths of being once considered limited to certain places and times. The first step may be simply to observe and be aware of how you relate to things. Two people can do the same thing and have a very different way of consciousness. How can we conceive of life and world in a way that is all-encompassing and non-dualistic? Let us look at the following words of the 20th century art critic Clement Greenberg. Erika, if you can read this, please.
Content is to be dissolved so completely into form that the work of art or literature cannot be reduced in whole or in part to anything not itself. The very values in the name of which he invokes the absolute are relative values, the values of aesthetics. And so he turns out to be imitating not God, and here I use imitate in its Aristotelian sense, but the disciplines and processes of art and literature themselves. This is the genesis of the abstract. In turning his attention away from subject matter of common experience, the poet or artist turns it in upon the medium of his own craft.
Thank you. So we see here something similar to what we've been discussing, where we let go of any correspondence to an ideal, and instead we experience the pure materiality, or the all-encompassingness of everything, as one continuous thing in itself. So Greenberg here is arguing that, at least in this particular text, that art exists in its materiality, not necessarily as a correspondence to some ideal. Hence, it abstracts itself from form by ironically absorbing form as part of itself. And with this in mind, we can look at the following texts from Theodor Adorno. I'll invite Maja to read these too.
Music did not represent anything outside of itself. It was on the order of prayer and play, not painting and writing. The language of music is quite different than the language of intentionality. It contains a theological dimension. What it has to say is simultaneously revealed and concealed. Its idea is the divine name which has been given shape. It is demythologized prayer, rid of efficacious magic. It is the human attempt, doomed as ever, to name the name, not to communicate meanings. It is by distancing itself from language that its resemblance to language finds its fulfillment.
I think this rather paradoxical text might be the closest we can get to in our hopes of being in a state that is, let's say, freed from the structures of attempting to correspond to some ideal or to strive towards something, but to be present within that status. But always to be aware that it will never achieve. It's always in the attempt that we are dwelling. And I think it's interesting how music doesn't fall victim as easily to ideology or to essence as language does, or spoken language does. You know, when you play something, it could certainly be evocative, but what it evokes will be far less exact than a word. And by not being exact, and by remaining in that state of evocativeness, we are able to free ourselves from anything else but the present. Does that make sense?
Yes. I don't know if that is probably leading too far, but that's also very dangerous. That's why any political movement can take music and put it, as we would say in German, vor den eigenen Karren. Because it has this quality of evoking the present and being such a strong thing in the present. Anyone who wants to manipulate someone somewhere can use music, and that's a huge history, but maybe here that leads too far, I don't know.
Well, no, I think actually what you bring up is very related to what we're talking about in Rosh Hashana, because by returning to a state that we can maybe call a musical state, that also allows us a flexibility to step out of the structures that had limited us before. So if we're talking about this idea of transformation and growth, that requires us to let go of those structures. So just like what you're referring to, where dangerous, let's say, politics and ideologies are able to manipulate us by getting us into that music state and then reforming us, we can do the same thing to ourselves. We can attempt to grow and to transform by entering that music state. And that's my purpose, in fact, for bringing this text.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to point out that at first glance, I think language is more specific. But I've experienced, like, especially in discussions or conversations, if you really want to truly understand someone, then you come to find that people have different meanings for the same word. So actually, I've experienced that sometimes when you really look into a conversation or a topic, that depending on how you grew up or what background you have different meanings or interpretations of maybe the same word you're using. So that's just something to...
I mean, you don't even know if my blue is your blue.
That's just one very good example.
But what is interesting, though, is there is a conventionality. So we can acknowledge that we're participating in a certain structure or game, and then you can demand of the person to understand the right blue, because they would have to be privy to the rules of the game. So, for example, with currency, we do that all the time.
Yeah.
We all agree that 10 euros, the 10 euro bill is a 10 euro bill. And if somebody says, well, to me, it's not, we're not going to accept that.
I mean, it's going to work for them, but it's not going to work.
It'll work for them as much as it'll work for them.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's the point. Okay, but let's get back to the text that Rebbe was looking at, where he says, know what is above from you. The Nefesh HaChaim, Reb Chaim Volozhiner, interprets this text in a way that is very different than the literal interpretation. So the literal interpretation would be advocating cultivating an awareness and knowledge of that which is beyond and above you. But Reb Chaim Volozhiner takes a radically different approach. And he says, above, all of it is from you. So you are the one that creates what is above. So know that all that is above comes from you. So this is such a wonderful reconfiguration of the text.
But for me, it really connects to what some text said right at the beginning, that we all are creators. Like each year at this holiday, we all create our own world, and that fits really well to how he interprets.
I wonder how it ended up on Rashi.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So to Reb Chaim, the what of the above is constructed from the subject, through the subject's actions and perceptions. Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi, Rebbe's choice of looking, allows for such a radical reading that places all of the contents of the world on how the individual makes the world. And I want to also emphasize here, it's kind of interesting that sometimes by being conservative in preserving a structure, you actually allow for a far more radical and dynamic understanding. Because if, for example, we had to preserve the meaning behind those words and not the structure, then the meaning might stay the same overall, but we would lose that opportunity to reconfigure meaning. And I think if you want to stick to the example of Pittlerwerke here in Leipzig, if they made a rule that this space could only be zoned for industry, then it would be quite limiting. They wouldn't care if the building was destroyed or not, but they care about what the space is used for. Or alternatively, if you say, hey, as long as the building stays, we don't care what you do in it. That allows for a far more dynamic state when it comes to the spirit, because the spirit can change, specifically by conserving the structure. And I think that's what happens also with music too, where keeping the notes, preserving the composition, can actually allow for a much more dynamic reading of music than saying this has to be a funeral song, or this has to be a wedding song, or this has to be a military march. One cannot help but think, just as there are those exhaustive types who are weighed down by everything and see the world above them as a heavy emotional draining burden, there are also their opposites who are uplifted and elated by everything and see the world above them as something pulling them higher and higher. If you're surrounded by more exhaustive rather than elated types, you can learn from the exhaustive types too. Just do the exact opposite of what they do. The Marxian theorist Georg Lukács observed in the following text that Paul, if you can read.
Reality itself, in accordance with its objective nature, is historical. The historical determinants of content and form appearing in the various reflections are corresponding only more or less correct approximations to this aspect of objective reality. A definite historicity can, however, never exist in a mere change of content of unchanging forms with unalterable categories. This change of content must have a modifying influence on the forms, must lead first to certain functional shifts within the categorical system, and at a certain stage even to explicit transformations. The creation of new and the disappearance of old categories.
Thank you. I think here we see something that's very relevant to like what you guys are doing. Is he's saying that you have to go through and be aware of the old categories that constitute and bring us to where we are today, but in order to transcend them to a state of transformation. You have all studied music, and I'm curious about your relationship to the past as a springboard to something completely new, or that attempts to be completely new.
I think it's something personal. So like for me, at some point you realize you cannot learn everything to full detail. So and then also you have you want to do something new. So at some point you have to jump off it and do your own stuff. But that doesn't mean that you don't learn the old theories and old styles.
And sometimes
So-
when you change that, like Lukács would say, once you make that change, then what constitutes you also is different. So you get to a kind of new state of consciousness because you're no longer where you were before.
Yeah.
What explicit transformations are possible when we take a step back? And like Rebbe says, look, if all we see are old historical patterns of organizing life, can we take a cue from the revolutionary theory of Lukács and Rebbe Akiva and challenge ourselves to break from normative patterns of thinking and look into even that which is normally not looked into? We can return to another text from Lukács. I'll invite David to read.
Only when consciousness stands in such a relation to reality can theory and practice be united. But for this to happen, the emergence of consciousness must become the decisive step which the historical process must take towards its proper end.
Thank you. So we see here that Lukács argues both that consciousness is shaped by reality, as it is, but also that when we shift our consciousness, then a new reality is capable of emerging. How might this relate to making a new consciousness? How might this relate to world making? It is worth repeating Karen Barad at this point, where she says, existence is not an individual affair. The implications of this are wide-ranging, from how we conceive the very basics of how the way we organize life to much more complex questions of ethics, politics, and world. Yet for all that's generated from these intra-actions, at its core, we see an inherently undifferentiated state. In the Jewish tradition, there is what is known as a golem, a being that exists in pure materiality without a soul. There are two legends that describe the creation of the first human being as being in this golem state. As you read them, observe the similarities and differences. David.
Rabbi Tanchuma said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, in the hour when God created the first human, he created him as a golem, and he was stretched out from one end of the world to the other. Rabbi Judah Bar Simon said, while the human still lay as a golem, he was shown all the generations as their interpreters, all the generations and their sages, all the generations and their judges, all the generations and their leaders.
Thank you. So the first story we have here is that there was the original human being who existed in this golem state and was shown everything. So it saw the future, it saw everything, and everything was contained within it. Now let's look at another, a similar version, but different. I'll invite Paul to read this one.
Rabbi Barachaya said, when God wished to create the world, he began his creation with nothing other than the human, and made the human as a golem. When he prepared to cast a soul into him, he said, if I set him down now, it will be said that he was my partner in the work of creation. So I will leave him as a golem, until I have created everything else. When he had created everything, the angels said to him, aren't you going to make the human you spoke of? He replied, I made him long ago, only the soul is missing. Then he cast the soul into him. With him he began, and with him he concluded, as it is written, thou hast formed me before and behind. God said, behold, the human is become like one of us.
Thank you. So what are the similarities, what are the differences between these two stories? We can look in. So I think one thing that is an obvious difference is in the second story, there was a distance of time between when the soul, so the human being was created as a golem first, and then later he was given the soul. And how does that text conclude? It concludes that the human becomes like a god, right? God says, behold, the human has become like one of us. And he's associated with being a partner in creation. So rather than being created and remaining in that state, in this case, he has the potential to be a partner in creation. Let's look at a comment on this story on these two stories from the German-born scholar Gershom Scholem. I'll invite Maja to read.
The whole work of creation lies between man as a amorphous state and man as an animated being. And whereas the previous version, man was gathered from the whole world, here the whole world is concentrated in him.
Thank you. So we see here that these two legends demonstrate the tension we feel between ourselves and the world. On the one hand, we are a product of the world, the first legend, and on the other hand, the world is a product of us, the second legend. There is something to be said that the tradition preserves both legends. There's also something to be said about our desire to return to the primordial, soulless, unindividuated state when we were the world and didn't even have to be conscious of it because we were it. And I think this is something that oftentimes you might feel in like a festival or in a moment of incredible nature when you're just overwhelmed and you're absorbed. And you almost just want to, or maybe also late at night when if you're having trouble and you have anxiety and issues, you just want to bury yourself under a pillow and be absorbed or swallowed up by the earth. I think it's an interesting tension, one between us being creators and the other between us just falling back and being de-alienated from everything, that there's no distance or separation. I think the golem idea is useful when reading contemporary post-humanist and new materialist thinkers like Karen Barad, who challenge our conception of discourse, agency, and body. With the golem in mind, let us look at the following text. Erika.
Discourse is not a synonym for language. Discourse does not refer to linguistic or signifying systems, grammars, speech acts, or conversations. To think of discourse as mere spoken or written words, forming descriptive statements, is to enact the mistake of representationalist thinking. Discourse is not what is said. It is that which constrains and enables what can be said. Discursive practices define what counts as meaningful statements. Statements are not the mere utterances of the originating consciousness of a unified subject. Rather, statements and subjects emerge from a field of possibilities. This field of possibilities is not static or singular, but rather is a dynamic and contingent multiplicity.
Thank you. Is the golem state that field of possibilities? Does materializing ourselves into that state of pure matter offer us a chance to reconfigure ourselves? The Maggid of Mezrich interprets a Roman-era Talmudic text on the golem in a way that resonates with Barad's field of possibilities. David.
All the opposites are in the golem. There is a world that is called golem. It is the world of wisdom. If you want to transform something, you must raise the thing to the aspect of golem. There you can change it.
Great. So let me explain this, because this involves a hermeneutical technique called gematria. So in Hebrew, every letter has a numerical value. So like Aleph or A is 1, Beis or B is 2, Gimel is 3, and so forth. So the Hebrew word golem, the letters are Gimel, Lamed, Mem. The numerical value of that is 73. And it's the same as the numerical value of the word chokhmah, which means wisdom. So what he's saying is that you have to get to a status of golem in order to enter that space of wisdom. The Abder Rov, Rabbi Avraham Yehoshua Heschel, comments on this. David.
Everything appearing in one form cannot receive another one unless its initial form is disarranged and is made into the aspect of a golem without any attribute or form. And then one can make from this thing whatever attributes one wants.
Thank you. So what he's saying here is, in order to transform, you have to somehow shake yourself into the world, into this material state. And then you can be like Plato, like clay, and you can completely reconfigure yourself. I'm curious also in the realm of music, of performance. Is there any exercises you guys do when it comes to letting go of the notes or letting go of form or structure?
And for me, something comes to mind which I did for a number of weeks actually last year, where I tried to improvise. Like the first thing I do when I play is to improvise and to kind of just use the first thing that happens. So if I happen to play a C, then I'll work with that. If I happen to play a noise which is not even a sound, I work with that. So it's like to really, I got this input from a teacher of mine who said the first thing you should do when you start the day is to make music. Start with an impro and use whatever you've got.
Amazing. And I think what's interesting there, this really fits to our conversation about decentering, where there's no reason why one note should be privileged over another note.
True, yeah.
And by kind of letting go of these hierarchies, we're able to completely reconfigure the way that we see things, because that structure simply collapses. And this is what I want to conclude on, is exploring the Rosh Hashana task as one of disarranging and not disentangling, but rather rising to that primordial, entangled, subject-objectless, golem, field of possibilities state. Thank you all for participating. For everybody here who's watching, we really would love to invite you to stay involved with the SHIUR community. Every Wednesday, we have a weekly Zoom and a newsletter. We have many events, both digital and real life. You can connect with us on social media, on Instagram at SHIUR International, that's SHIUR International, or on Facebook. You can also reach out to me personally. I really want to thank all our participants here today. Happy Rosh Hashana.
Thank you.